Margaret Chen had always been different, though she never understood why that seemed to bother everyone else so much. Born in 1956 in a small farming town in Missouri, she grew up in a world where women were expected to know their place, and that place was certainly not behind a rifle scope. Her father, Robert Chen, was a second-generation Chinese American who had fought his own battles against prejudice his entire life. He owned a small hardware store and believed that hard work and keeping your head down were the keys to survival in a town that wasn't always kind to people who looked different. Margaret's mother, Eleanor, was a quiet woman who had married Robert against her family's wishes and spent most of her time trying to blend into the background of their small community. She taught Margaret to cook, clean, and speak softly, always reminding her that being noticed was dangerous for people like them. The Chen family lived in a modest house on Elm Street, where Margaret learned early that being exceptional in any way that drew attention was something to be avoided. But Margaret had a secret that even her parents didn't fully understand. Every weekend, while other girls her age were learning to bake pies or practicing piano, Margaret would sneak out to her grandfather's farm on the outskirts of town. Her grandfather, Thomas Chen, was different from his son. Where Robert was cautious and careful, Thomas was bold and uncompromising. He had served in World War II as part of the Chinese-American Composite Wing, flying dangerous missions over the Pacific that most people in their town had never heard about. Thomas owned a small shooting range behind his farmhouse, nothing fancy, just some targets set up against a hillside and a wooden bench where he would sit and practice with the rifle he had brought back from the war. It was a Springfield M1903, a weapon that had seen action in the Philippines and, later in Europe. The rifle was old even then, with rust eating at its barrel and a scope that had been damaged during a mission over Japan in 1944. Most people would have thrown it away or sold it for scrap, but Thomas kept it as a reminder of what he had survived. The first time Margaret touched that rifle, she was 8 years old. Thomas had been cleaning it on the porch when she arrived for her usual weekend visit. She was fascinated by the weight of it, the way it felt solid and important in her small hands. Thomas watched her examine every part of the weapon with the kind of focus most adults never managed, and something in his granddaughter's eyes reminded him of himself at her age. Against every rule of common sense, and certainly against what Robert and Eleanor would have approved of, Thomas decided to teach Margaret how to shoot. It started with safety lessons that lasted for months before she was ever allowed to load a single bullet. Thomas had learned discipline in the military, and he passed that same rigid structure on to his granddaughter. She learned to field strip the rifle, clean every component, understand how each part worked together to create the perfect shot. By the time Margaret was 10, she could hit a target at 50 yards with enough accuracy to impress even Thomas, who was not easily impressed. By 12, she was shooting at distances that would challenge experienced hunters. By 14, she was better than most of the men who came to Thomas's informal shooting competitions, though she was never allowed to participate officially because she was too young and, more importantly, because she was a girl. The shooting became Margaret's escape from a world that seemed determined to make her smaller. At school, she was the quiet Chinese girl who got good grades but never spoke up in class. The other students weren't necessarily cruel, but they weren't kind either. She existed in a space between acceptance and rejection, never quite belonging anywhere. Her teachers praised her academic work but always seemed surprised by her intelligence, as if they expected less from someone who looked like her. At home, her parents worried constantly about her future. Robert worked long hours at the hardware store, dealing with customers who sometimes made comments about his accent or questioned his knowledge about American tools and equipment. He wanted Margaret to be safe, to find a quiet job that wouldn't attract attention, maybe as a secretary or a teacher. Eleanor dreamed of Margaret marrying well, finding a man who would take care of her and protect her from the harsh realities of the world. But, on weekends at Thomas's farm, Margaret was free to be exceptional. She could push herself to be better, to achieve something that mattered, even if only her grandfather would ever see it. Thomas never made her feel like she was trying to be something she wasn't meant to be. Instead, he pushed her harder than anyone else ever had, demanding precision and consistency that would have broken most people. The rifle became an extension of Margaret's body. She learned to feel the wind, to calculate distance and elevation instinctively, to control her breathing and heartbeat in ways that seemed almost supernatural. Thomas taught her that shooting was 90% mental, that the physical act of pulling the trigger was the smallest part of the process. She learned to empty her mind of everything except the target, to become so focused that the rest of the world disappeared. When Margaret was 16, Thomas became sick. It started as a persistent cough that he insisted was just allergies, but by winter it had developed into something more serious. The doctors called it lung cancer, probably caused by years of exposure to chemicals during the war, though Thomas refused to blame anything except bad luck. He continued teaching Margaret even as the chemotherapy made him weak and thin, determined to pass on everything he knew before it was too late. During one of their last sessions together, Thomas pulled out a notebook that Margaret had never seen before. It was filled with diagrams, calculations, and notes written in his careful handwriting. These were all the techniques he had learned during the war, methods for shooting in difficult conditions, ways to compensate for damaged equipment, strategies for making impossible shots when everything was working against you. Thomas gave Margaret the notebook and made her promise that she would never stop practicing, never stop pushing herself to be better. He told her that someday she would need these skills for something important, though he couldn't say what. He made her promise that she would keep the rifle and take care of it, even when people told her it was worthless. 6 months later, Thomas died peacefully in his sleep. Margaret was devastated, but she kept her promises. She took the rifle and the notebook, and she continued practicing in secret. Robert wanted to sell the farm and everything in it, but Margaret begged him to let her keep just the rifle. He agreed reluctantly, though he made her promise to keep it locked away where no one would see it. For the next 2 years, Margaret's shooting practice became sporadic. Without Thomas's farm, she had to find other places to practice, usually abandoned quarries or empty fields where no one would notice her. The rifle stayed wrapped in an old blanket in her bedroom closet, taken out only when she could find a safe place to use it. Margaret graduated from high school with excellent grades and a scholarship to the state university. Her parents were proud but worried about sending their daughter away from home. The world was changing rapidly in the 1970s, and it wasn't always clear whether those changes would be good for people like them. Robert had saved enough money to help with expenses, but he made Margaret promise to study something practical, something that would guarantee her a good job. Margaret chose engineering, partly because she was genuinely interested in how things worked and partly because it seemed like the kind of field where precision and technical skill would matter more than social connections. She was one of only 3 women in most of her classes, and the only Asian student in her entire program. The other students weren't hostile, but they weren't welcoming either. She spent most of her time studying alone, earning top grades while remaining almost invisible to her classmates. The rifle stayed locked in a storage unit near campus, visited only during school breaks when Margaret could drive out to remote areas and practice. She never told anyone about her shooting skills, never mentioned her grandfather or the notebook filled with military techniques. It seemed like information from another life, something that belonged to the past rather than the future she was building. After graduation, Margaret found a job with a small engineering firm in Kansas City. The work was challenging and the pay was decent, but she felt constantly like she was proving herself in ways that her male colleagues never had to. Every project was a test, every mistake was evidence that maybe women didn't belong in engineering after all. She worked longer hours than anyone else, double-checked every calculation, and slowly built a reputation as someone who could be trusted with difficult problems. Margaret met David Wong when she was 25. He was another engineer, quiet and methodical like she was, and he seemed genuinely impressed by her intelligence rather than threatened by it. They dated for 2 years before getting married in a small ceremony that both sets of parents found satisfactory. David knew about Margaret's grandfather and the rifle, but he had never seen her shoot and didn't really understand what it meant to her. The early years of marriage were good. Margaret and David bought a small house in the suburbs and settled into a comfortable routine of work and weekend projects. Margaret kept the rifle in their basement, wrapped in its blanket and largely forgotten. Sometimes she would take it out and clean it, remembering Thomas's lessons about maintenance and care, but there was no place nearby to practice and no time for such luxuries. When Margaret was 28, she became pregnant with their first child. The pregnancy was difficult, and the doctors recommended she take time off work. During those long months at home, Margaret found herself thinking more and more about her grandfather and the skills he had taught her. She would sometimes sit in the basement, holding the old rifle and reading through Thomas's notebook, wondering if she was losing something important by letting those abilities fade away. Margaret's daughter Sarah was born on a cold February morning in 1985, and everything changed. The baby was healthy and beautiful, with David's eyes and Margaret's stubborn chin, but motherhood brought challenges that Margaret had never anticipated. The engineering firm where she worked offered only 6 weeks of maternity leave, and, when Margaret returned to work, she found that her responsibilities had been quietly redistributed to her male colleagues. Her supervisor, Jim Patterson, was apologetic but firm. The company needed people who could travel on short notice and work late when projects demanded it. Surely Margaret understood that her priorities had changed now that she was a mother. The message was clear without being stated directly: serious engineering work was no longer something she could be trusted with. Margaret tried to fight back professionally, documenting every instance of discrimination and building a case that she hoped would protect her job. But the more she pushed, the more isolated she became. Her male colleagues began treating her like a problem to be managed rather than an asset to be valued. Projects that should have been hers were given to less experienced engineers who happened to be men. Her ideas in meetings were ignored or credited to others. Within 2 years, it became clear that her career at the firm had reached a dead end. Margaret began looking for other opportunities, but every interview seemed to end the same way. Potential employers would be impressed by her resume and her technical knowledge, but the conversation always turned to her family responsibilities. Could she travel? Could she work overtime? What would happen if her child got sick? The questions were illegal, but they were asked anyway, usually in ways that gave the interviewer plausible deniability. Margaret learned to anticipate them and prepare careful answers that emphasized her commitment and flexibility, but it didn't seem to matter. She was caught in an impossible situation, too qualified to be dismissed entirely but too much of a perceived risk to be hired for the position she deserved. David tried to be supportive, but he didn't fully understand what Margaret was experiencing. His own career was progressing smoothly, with regular promotions and increasing responsibilities. He suggested that maybe Margaret should consider taking a few years off to focus on raising Sarah, at least until she was old enough for school. They could manage financially on his salary alone, and wasn't it important for children to have a full-time parent during their early years? The suggestion made practical sense, but it felt like surrender to Margaret. She had worked so hard to establish herself as an engineer, to prove that she belonged in a male-dominated field. Taking time off would mean starting over later, assuming she could ever get back into the field at all. But the alternatives seemed equally impossible. Childcare was expensive and unreliable, and the stress of trying to balance everything was affecting her health and her relationship with David. In the end, Margaret made the choice that millions of women before her had made. She left her job and became a full-time mother, telling herself it was temporary while secretly fearing it might be permanent. The transition was harder than she had expected. Engineering had given her a sense of identity and purpose that domestic life couldn't replace. She loved Sarah deeply, but caring for a toddler didn't provide the intellectual challenges that Margaret craved. The rifle remained in the basement, visited even less frequently now that Margaret's days were filled with diaper changes, feeding schedules, and the endless tasks of maintaining a household. Sometimes, during Sarah's naps, Margaret would escape to the basement and hold the old weapon, remembering the confidence she had felt on her grandfather's farm. Those memories seemed to belong to a different person, someone who had believed she could be exceptional at something that mattered. When Sarah turned 3, Margaret discovered she was pregnant again. The second pregnancy was easier than the first, but it made the possibility of returning to work even more remote. James was born in 1988, a quiet baby who seemed content to watch the world with serious dark eyes that reminded Margaret of her grandfather. David's career continued to flourish. He was promoted to project manager and began traveling frequently for work. Margaret supported his success enthusiastically, but she couldn't ignore the growing distance between them. David came home with stories of challenging projects and important clients, while Margaret's days were measured in small victories like getting both children fed and dressed before noon. The isolation was the hardest part. Margaret had always been somewhat solitary, but now she was surrounded by people who lived completely different lives. The other mothers in the neighborhood were friendly but focused on topics that didn't interest Margaret much. Conversations about the best preschools and children's activities felt important but somehow insufficient. Margaret tried to maintain her engineering skills by reading technical journals and taking correspondence courses, but it was difficult to find uninterrupted time for serious study. The field was changing rapidly, with new technologies and methodologies that she struggled to keep up with. Each month that passed made returning to work feel less realistic. When Sarah started kindergarten, Margaret considered looking for part-time work, but James was still too young for school and daycare costs would have consumed most of her potential salary. She volunteered at Sarah's school instead, helping with reading programs and science fairs. The work was meaningful, but it didn't fill the growing sense that her real talents were being wasted. It was during this period that Margaret first heard about the local shooting club. Sarah had joined the Girl Scouts, and one of the other mothers mentioned that her husband belonged to a group that met at a range outside town. Margaret felt a sudden surge of interest that surprised her. She had thought about shooting so rarely in recent years that the desire felt like a message from a buried part of herself. That night, Margaret asked David what he thought about her learning to shoot. David was puzzled by the question. He knew about the rifle in the basement, but he had assumed it was just a family heirloom with no practical relevance. Why would Margaret want to take up shooting now? Was she feeling unsafe in their quiet suburban neighborhood? Margaret tried to explain without revealing the full extent of her past experience. She said she was curious about firearms, that it seemed like a skill worth having. David wasn't enthusiastic about the idea, but he didn't forbid it either. If Margaret wanted to try something new, he supposed shooting was no more unusual than tennis or pottery classes. Margaret called the shooting club the next day, her heart pounding as she spoke to the man who answered the phone. His name was Bill Harrison, and he sounded friendly but skeptical when she explained that she was interested in learning to shoot. The club was mostly made up of retired men and experienced hunters, he explained. They didn't get many women, and they certainly didn't get many beginners who showed up without their husbands. But Bill agreed to let Margaret visit the range and see if shooting was something she really wanted to pursue. He warned her that the other members might not be particularly welcoming at first, and that she would need to demonstrate serious commitment before anyone would take her seriously. Margaret assured him that she understood, though she didn't mention that she probably had more shooting experience than most of the club's current members. The range was located on private property about 20 miles outside town, a collection of simple buildings surrounded by carefully maintained shooting lanes that extended out to various distances. Margaret arrived on a Saturday morning, nervous but excited in ways she hadn't felt for years. She had brought Thomas's rifle, though she kept it in its case and didn't mention its history. Bill Harrison turned out to be a man in his 60s with gray hair and calloused hands that spoke of decades of manual labor. He looked Margaret over carefully, taking in her suburban appearance and obvious nervousness. She didn't look like someone who belonged at a shooting range, but Bill had learned over the years that appearances could be deceiving. The other club members were less welcoming. Most of them glanced at Margaret and then ignored her, apparently assuming she wouldn't last long enough to be worth acknowledging. A few made comments that were intended to be humorous but came across as condescending. One man suggested that Margaret might be more comfortable at the craft fair that was happening in town the same weekend. Margaret endured the comments without responding, focusing instead on watching how the range operated. The club members were using a variety of weapons, from modern hunting rifles to vintage military surplus. The targets were set at different distances, and there seemed to be informal competitions happening throughout the day. Margaret studied the techniques being used, noting the differences between what she saw and what her grandfather had taught her. Bill eventually invited Margaret to try shooting one of the club's rifles, a modern weapon with an excellent scope and careful adjustments. He started her with basic safety instruction, apparently assuming she knew nothing about firearms. Margaret listened patiently, asking occasional questions that suggested she was paying attention without revealing the depth of her existing knowledge. When Margaret finally took her first shot, she deliberately aimed slightly off target. The shot was close enough to demonstrate that she wasn't completely hopeless, but far enough off to avoid drawing attention. She wanted to understand the social dynamics of the club before revealing what she was really capable of. Over the following weeks, Margaret became a regular at the range. She brought Sarah and James with her sometimes, setting them up with books and snacks while she practiced. The children seemed to enjoy the outings, and Margaret found that shooting provided a mental clarity she had missed desperately during her years of full-time motherhood. Margaret gradually improved her apparent skill level, careful not to advance too quickly. She asked questions that demonstrated she was learning, accepted advice from club members who were eager to help the enthusiastic beginner, and slowly built relationships with people who had initially viewed her with suspicion. The rifle work was therapeutic in ways Margaret had forgotten. The concentration required to make accurate shots pushed everything else out of her mind. For those few hours each week, she wasn't thinking about household chores or children's schedules or the career she had abandoned. She was focused entirely on the target, breathing steadily, calculating wind and distance, feeling the familiar weight of Thomas's rifle in her hands. After several months of careful progress, Margaret began to let her true skill show through more clearly. She started making shots that impressed even the experienced club members, demonstrating a natural talent that seemed remarkable for someone who had supposedly started shooting so recently. Bill Harrison began to look at her with new interest, suspecting there was more to Margaret's background than she had revealed. The other club members' attitudes toward Margaret began to change as well. They stopped treating her like a curious outsider and started including her in their conversations about technique and equipment. Some of them began asking her opinion about their own shooting, recognizing that she had insights that came from somewhere beyond beginner's luck. Margaret found herself looking forward to her range days with an anticipation she hadn't felt about anything in years. The club gave her a place where her skills mattered, where she could be excellent at something again. It was a small community, but it was one where she belonged in ways that the neighborhood playgroups and school committees had never provided. By 1995, Margaret had been a member of the shooting club for 3 years, and her reputation had grown considerably. What had started as casual weekend practice had evolved into something more serious. She was consistently among the top shooters at the club's informal competitions, and word was beginning to spread to other ranges in the area about the suburban mother who could outshoot most of the experienced hunters and military veterans. Margaret's children were now 10 and 7, old enough to spend Saturday afternoons at the range without requiring constant supervision. Sarah had developed an interest in the technical aspects of shooting, asking detailed questions about ballistics and wind compensation that impressed the club members. James was more interested in the social aspects, charming the older men with his curiosity about their military service and hunting stories. David's reaction to Margaret's shooting success was complicated. He was proud of her achievements, but he didn't fully understand why she had become so passionate about what seemed to him like an unusual hobby. He worried sometimes about the time and money Margaret was spending on ammunition and equipment, though he had to admit that she seemed happier and more confident than she had been in years. The club's annual competitions had become important events for Margaret. She had won the women's division 3 years running, though the women's field was admittedly small. What impressed people more was that Margaret's scores often exceeded those of the men's division winners. She had a consistency and precision that seemed almost supernatural, especially when shooting at longer distances where small errors in technique became magnified. Bill Harrison had become something of a mentor to Margaret, though their relationship was different from the one she had shared with her grandfather. Bill was impressed by Margaret's natural ability, but he was also curious about her background. Her shooting form was too perfect, too ingrained, to have been developed entirely during her time at the club. When pressed, Margaret would admit that her grandfather had taught her some basics, but she was careful not to reveal the full extent of her early training. The truth was that Margaret was holding back significantly during club competitions. Thomas's old rifle was capable of extraordinary accuracy, and Margaret's skills had grown even sharper during her years of practice. But she was conscious of maintaining relationships within the club, and she sensed that completely dominating the competitions might not be socially wise. This delicate balance was disrupted in the spring of 1996, when the club received a visit from members of the county's premier shooting organization. The Riverside County Marksmanship Association was a much more formal group than Margaret's club, with serious competitions, cash prizes, and members who treated shooting as a professional-level pursuit rather than a recreational activity. The visiting team was led by a man named Richard Kellerman, a former Marine who owned a successful sporting goods store and had a reputation as one of the finest shooters in the state. Kellerman was accompanied by 2 other men, both of whom had won regional competitions and qualified for national events. They had heard rumors about the suburban mother who was setting records at the local club, and they wanted to see for themselves whether the stories were true. Margaret was practicing when the visitors arrived, working through a series of shots at 200 yards with Thomas's old rifle. She was aware that she was being watched, but she tried to maintain her usual routine without showing off. Her shots were tight and consistent, grouped well within what most shooters would consider excellent performance. Kellerman and his companions observed for about 15 minutes before approaching Margaret directly. Kellerman introduced himself politely, complimenting Margaret on her shooting and asking about her background. Margaret gave her standard explanation about learning from her grandfather and developing her skills at the local club, but Kellerman's question suggested he suspected there was more to the story. The conversation was friendly but had an undertone that Margaret found unsettling. Kellerman seemed to be evaluating her, measuring her skills against some standard she wasn't aware of. His companions were less subtle, making comments about Margaret's rifle that bordered on mocking. One of them suggested that Margaret might be even better if she upgraded to modern equipment instead of shooting what looked like a museum piece. Bill Harrison stepped into the conversation, explaining Margaret's consistent success in local competitions and her growing reputation among shooters in the region. Kellerman listened with interest, but Margaret could see skepticism in his expression. The world of competitive shooting was small and interconnected, and success at the local level didn't necessarily translate to performance against serious competition. After some additional conversation, Kellerman made what seemed like a casual suggestion. The Riverside County Marksmanship Association was hosting their annual championship in 2 months, and they were always interested in discovering new talent. Perhaps Margaret would like to enter the competition and see how her skills measured against shooters from across the state. Margaret's initial reaction was to decline politely. She enjoyed shooting at the club level, but she had never considered entering serious competitions. The local events were friendly and social, while what Kellerman was describing sounded much more intense and formal. But one of Kellerman's companions, a thin man named Derek Morrison who had been largely silent during the conversation, spoke up with a comment that changed everything. Morrison suggested that maybe Margaret was smart to avoid real competition, since local club shooting was very different from events where every shot mattered. He said it with a smile, but the implication was clear: Margaret was successful only because she was competing against weekend hobbyists rather than serious shooters. The comment stung more than Margaret wanted to admit. She had spent years carefully managing her reputation within the club, trying to be successful without being threatening. But Morrison's dismissal touched something deeper, a sense that her real abilities were being underestimated in ways that felt familiar and frustrating. Margaret told Kellerman she would consider entering the competition, though she made it clear that she would need to think carefully about the commitment. Competitive shooting required different preparation than casual range work, and she had family responsibilities that couldn't be ignored. That night, Margaret discussed the invitation with David. He was surprised by the offer but skeptical about Margaret's interest in accepting it. The competition would require significant travel and preparation time, and the entry fees and equipment costs could be substantial. More importantly, David wasn't sure why Margaret felt the need to prove herself against strangers when she was already successful at the local level. Margaret struggled to explain her feelings without revealing how much Morrison's comment had bothered her. She told David that the competition represented an opportunity to test her skills and maybe learn from more experienced shooters. It would be a chance to see how good she really was, rather than simply being the best shooter in a small group. David eventually agreed to support Margaret's participation, though he remained puzzled by her motivation. They could afford the entry fees and travel expenses, and Margaret had certainly earned the right to pursue her interests. If she wanted to enter one serious competition to satisfy her curiosity, he wouldn't stand in her way. Margaret spent the following weeks researching the Riverside County Championship and the other competitors who would be participating. The event was more formal than anything she had experienced, with multiple divisions, strict rules, and prize money that attracted shooters from several states. The course of fire included shots at various distances, with different positions and time limits that would test every aspect of a competitor's skills. Most intimidating were the profiles of the top competitors. Many of them had military or law enforcement backgrounds, with years of professional training and access to expensive, precisely tuned equipment. They competed regularly in regional and national events, earning rankings and reputations that Margaret couldn't match. Margaret also researched the equipment that would be allowed in the competition. Thomas's old rifle met the technical requirements, but it would be competing against weapons that cost more than Margaret's car. The scopes alone on some of the modern rifles represented technology that hadn't existed when her grandfather's weapon was manufactured. As the competition date approached, Margaret found herself torn between excitement and anxiety. Part of her was eager to test her skills against serious opposition, to find out whether the abilities Thomas had taught her could succeed in professional-level competition. But another part of her wondered whether she was setting herself up for public humiliation, risking the confidence she had built up during her years at the local club. The night before leaving for the competition, Margaret spent several hours in the basement with Thomas's rifle, cleaning and adjusting every component with the care her grandfather had taught her. She read through his notebook again, reviewing the techniques for shooting in difficult conditions and compensating for equipment limitations. Margaret had decided that regardless of the outcome, she would shoot with the rifle Thomas had given her. It would be a disadvantage against modern equipment, but it felt like the right way to honor the man who had believed in her abilities when no one else did. If she was going to compete seriously for the first time in her life, she would do it with the weapon that had taught her everything she knew about precision and focus. The drive to the competition took 3 hours, giving Margaret time to think about what she hoped to accomplish. She wasn't expecting to win against such experienced competition, but she wanted to perform well enough to prove that her local success wasn't just a matter of limited competition. She wanted to show Morrison and Kellerman that she belonged in serious shooting events, even if she didn't plan to make competition a regular part of her life. Margaret arrived at the range early, wanting to familiarize herself with the facility and the competition routine before other shooters arrived. The range was impressive, with professional quality equipment and shooting lanes that extended to distances her local club couldn't accommodate. Everything was designed for serious competition, from the timing systems to the target retrieval mechanisms. As other competitors began arriving, Margaret felt increasingly out of place. Most of the shooters looked like they had been doing this for years, with expensive equipment cases and the confident manner of people who knew exactly what they were doing. Margaret's simple rifle case and modest shooting outfit marked her clearly as an outsider. The registration process was intimidating as well. Margaret had to provide documentation of her club membership and shooting experience, though her credentials looked minimal compared to the military records and competition histories of the other participants. The officials were polite but clearly surprised to see someone with such limited formal experience entering such a demanding competition. Margaret was assigned to Squad C, which would shoot in the afternoon after the more experienced competitors had completed their rounds. This gave her time to observe the morning shooters and get a sense of the competition standards, but it also meant several hours of nervous waiting before her turn to prove herself. The morning shooters were everything Margaret had expected and more. She positioned herself in the observation area and watched as competitor after competitor delivered performance that exceeded anything she had ever witnessed. The precision was stunning, the consistency was remarkable, and the equipment was absolutely state-of-the-art. Modern rifles with computerized scopes, custom triggers adjusted to ounces, and ammunition that had been hand-loaded to exact specifications. Richard Kellerman was among the first to shoot, and his performance was a masterclass in competitive marksmanship. Every shot was deliberate and controlled, and his groupings at 300 yards were tighter than most shooters could achieve at 100 yards. The man clearly deserved his reputation, and Margaret found herself wondering what had possessed her to think she could compete at this level. Derek Morrison shot in the second relay, and his performance was nearly as impressive as Kellerman's. Morrison had a different style, more aggressive and quick, but equally effective. Margaret noticed that he glanced in her direction several times during his string of fire, apparently checking to see if she was watching. The gesture felt like a subtle form of psychological pressure, a reminder that she would soon be measured against the standard he was setting. By noon, Margaret was seriously considering withdrawing from the competition. The morning scores were posted on a large board near the registration table, and they were intimidating. Kellerman was leading with a score that was nearly perfect, and even the shooters in the middle of the pack were performing at levels that Margaret wasn't certain she could match. Margaret called David from a payphone outside the range building, needing to hear a familiar voice before making her final decision about competing. David could hear the uncertainty in her voice, but he encouraged her to follow through with her original plan. She had come this far, he pointed out, and withdrawing now would mean always wondering what might have happened if she had tried. Sarah and James were both on the phone as well, excited about their mother's big competition and eager to hear how she was doing. Their enthusiasm was infectious, and Margaret found herself remembering why she had wanted to enter the competition in the first place. It wasn't really about winning or proving anything to Kellerman and Morrison. It was about testing herself against the best possible competition and finding out what her grandfather's training had really prepared her for. Margaret returned to the range with renewed determination. She found a quiet corner and unpacked Thomas's rifle, taking time to inspect every component and make minor adjustments to the scope. The weapon looked ancient compared to the modern equipment around her, but Margaret knew its capabilities better than anyone. More importantly, she knew her own capabilities with this particular rifle. Squad C was called to the firing line at 2 p.m., and Margaret took her assigned position with a mixture of nervousness and excitement. The morning sun cast long shadows across the abandoned shooting range as Margaret Chin stepped out of her grandfather's dusty pickup truck. In her weathered hands, she carried a rifle that had seen 2 wars, 3 continents, and more battles than most soldiers could imagine. The metal was pitted with rust, the wooden stock scarred from decades of use, and the scope had been cracked since 1943. To everyone watching from the sidelines, she looked like a woman who had lost her mind. A 67-year-old grandmother challenging the county's best marksman with a weapon that belonged in a museum, not a competition. The whispers had already started, the cruel laughter echoing across the empty field. They didn't know that this moment had been building for 40 years, that every insult, every dismissal, every time someone told her she wasn't good enough had led to this single shot. What they were about to witness wouldn't just shatter records, it would shatter everything they thought they knew about determination, legacy, and the power of proving everyone wrong. Because sometimes, the most unlikely heroes carry the heaviest burdens, and sometimes, one perfect shot can change not just a competition, but an entire life's worth of doubt.